We made this.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of CHUCKYVISION, the podcast that covers all things Chucky. We have covered the movies, we've covered Season 1 of the TV show. We are going to be covering Season 2 of the TV show when that comes out. Today, with my co-host Mark.
Hello.
We're going to be covering a really interesting piece of the Chucky saga. We're going to be covering a movie from 1953, referenced quite significantly in the Chucky films. Not just a throwaway reference like Camp Fear was referenced in Season 1 of Chucky. No, he named a character. He named the son of Chucky and Tiffany, Glen and Glenda, and we're going to be getting into that movie today. The Chucky franchise has progressively, as it's gone on, under the control of its gay creator, Don Mancini, it's been involving new storylines of gay and intergender characters, all sorts of interesting new concepts. This reference, quite significant, not just in movies, but real history, because this was a movie that was dealing with lots of concepts way back in the 50s. So, Mark, what did you know about Glen or Glenda before today?
So I'd seen Ed Wood, which is a fantastic film. And I'd also seen Plan 9 from Outer Space, which is a film. I genuinely enjoyed Plan 9 from Outer Space because I love stupid tat. I love ridiculously bad films, you know? I've always been drawn to a film that's so bad it's good. And so I knew about Ed Wood, and I did know his desire to dress in women's clothes because of the film Ed Wood as well. And I knew Bela Lugosi was in it because, again, this was all confirmed by the film Ed Wood, but I hadn't seen it. I knew it was very sympathetic, though. I didn't know what to expect, but I did see that it had been regarded as one of the worst films of all time. And I call bullshit on that.
Yeah, I'm going to touch upon that quote. I don't really know, on a technical standpoint, maybe. That is a quote that could easily be attributed to Plan 9 or any of Ed Wood's more traditional genre films. This is a very experimental and sympathetically, it's a very brave film.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it definitely does not deserve, well, the treatment it got. We'll get into the history of it, but I don't think many people really regard it as a terrible movie. It's more so it just because of who Ed Wood was. It was a very low budget production that got buried, researched, got buried again in like the 80s. And then only now is it getting really fair critical treatment.
You can't compare something like this with its social commentary to something like Plan 9 from Outer Space, any more than you can really compare, I don't know, let's make a cliche out of this, Schindler's List to E.T. Just because they're by the same director doesn't mean they should be treated the same.
We'll see some of the themes in this, and some of the themes relating to Ed Wood, they do feed into his other movies. So this is not something he made in isolation. I made a lot of notes. I made a lot of research on the context of this, on Ed Wood as a person. I'm going to try and feed all that into our discussion. We want to stay focused on the movie. And also, let's not forget, this is a podcast about Chucky, and not the life and times of a director from the 50s. I will say, I think it's important to point out, since a lot of my research is from one source, I'll point out it's from d2rights.com, a Dead to Rights website by Joe Blevins, article upon article upon article on Ed Wood. So if you really want to know more about this movie, he's basically written like biographies. And it is a fascinating story. So I'm going to give a little context about who Edward D. Wood Jr. is. He kind of came into Hollywood as this Errol Flynn type guy. If you've seen the movie Ed Wood by Tim Burton, slick back hair, mustache, he was a very dapper young man. He went into Hollywood in the 40s, but he didn't know anyone in Hollywood. So he was doing adverts and films and TV serial westerns and stuff, the cheapest of cheap stuff. We know it's hard to know exactly who the man was because he said that he had served in World War II. He did at a desk job, but he said that he fought and killed Japanese soldiers. He also claimed that he grew up in a freak show. His part in the circus was the half man, half woman. That actually reminds me of Glen's history in Seed of Chucky. There's a moment where Glen is part of a circus act.
Yeah, that's true. We certainly didn't mention that when we looked at Seed of Chucky, but now you've said it, that makes a lot of sense.
That's what I mean. There's a lot of contextual history within Ed Wood's life that relates to this movie. Supposedly, his mother would dress him in girls' clothes as a punishment. That kind of is referenced in the movie. This is a weird anecdote. As a child, when he got his first camera, he recorded footage of the airship Hindenburg passing over the Hudson River. A weird omen of disasters to come with Ed Wood and a camera.
True.
He started in Hollywood in the 40s. It would take 5 or 6 years before he got to make his first feature film, Glen or Glenda. Leonard Maltin did say, possibly the worst movie ever made, but supposedly David Lynch said this is one of his favourite movies.
I know, right? And David Lynch is one of a kind, and I can absolutely see why this is one of his favourite films.
I've made some notes. This feels quite a lot like David Lynch films. It's odd how there is a strange amount of talent in this first movie that you don't see in later movies like Plan 9.
No, you're right. There were 2 versions on Amazon. Black and white one, which you needed a subscription for. Luckily, I hadn't had that particular subscription before, so I had the week's trial and watched it for nothing. But the other one was a colorized version. And I just can't get behind colorizing old films. I don't see why we need to. Surely part of their original charm is that they're in black and white.
I would give it a go. I imagine, I'm just guessing, that came during Paramount, for some reason, had this movie. And they tried to put it in some theatres as a limited release in the 80s. And that may have been when they put the colour on it, just to be more interesting for modern audiences. Yeah, there are a couple of different versions about this. There is, and I don't believe we watched it, there is a slightly longer version of this, only by a couple minutes.
Oh, okay. I just watched the one that was on Amazon.
It's one of those movies where I do believe it is still in copyright. I mean, it's on YouTube. There's all sorts of low quality versions of this movie out and about. And before we get into any discussions of its subject matter, which it has a lot of subject matter to it, and before we even feel about how we enjoyed the viewing, it's important to really hammer down exactly what this movie is, because it is not a traditional movie by any means of the word traditional.
No.
It was originally produced to exploit a real trans woman's story, for starters. The real woman, Christine Jorgensen. She's a fascinating woman. This film then got hijacked by Ed Wood, because this movie is not about a trans woman. It's barely about transgender issues at all. It only took 4 days to shoot, because Ed Wood likes to shoot fast and cheap. Just over an hour long, and about 14 minutes of that is stock footage.
Oh, I didn't realise there was that much stock footage.
There's quite a bit of stock footage, yeah.
Well, that's the dream sequence, isn't it? Which apparently wasn't Ed Wood's choice.
Because his film is split into 2 stories, although one of the stories is like 5 minutes long. The second story was added. That was the only part that was about transgender issues. The rest of it is about how do you pronounce that word? I know transvestite, but transvestitism?
Transvestitism, yeah, I think
that's
so.
It. I don't know why I struggle with that word. Is that's still the common word to use now? Transvestite? Because in the film, they talk about how that is not an insult. That's like the medical word. Is that still, in modern culture, still fine?
You don't have transvestites performing anymore. They're all referred to as drag queens, because there is a distinction between a man who wears women's clothes to entertain as a drag queen. Well, in fact, anyone who wears women's clothes to entertain as a drag queen. There's Victoria Scone, based in the UK, who is a female impersonator, and she's a brilliant drag queen. A drag queen is very different to a transvestite, but when I first started going out on the scene in Manchester, you would call someone dressed as a woman as an entertainment show, you would call that a transvestite. But that's not the case anymore. Obviously, the term trans is an umbrella term. It would probably be more subtly referred to as a man who wears women's clothes, is what Patrick and Patricia, or Glen and Glenda, are in this film. They are just men who wear women's clothes. It's not a sexual thing. It is just that they want to wear women's clothes either all the time or sometimes. And that isn't the same as being trans, being a woman trapped in a man's body. There is clear distinctions here that are there in modern life, but in the 50s weren't. But what struck me about this whole film was the sensitivity and the empathy, despite the lack of vocabulary.
This film is basically an hour of Ed Wood asking questions, because it doesn't really feel like it gives us any answers, especially not to a modern audience, because a lot of what this film gives out is kind of antiquated.
Antiquated, but well-meaning.
It's well-meaning. You can tell all of this is written in Ed Wood's voice, and by the end of it, we're not really that much clearer on most of this. Very much seems like Ed Wood is coming to grips with who he is. I imagine it was definitely cathartic for him, but it doesn't seem like this fixed everything.
To me, it seems like Ed Wood is still not quite comfortable in his own skin and his own what he called transvestism. He is clearly wants to be accepted and left alone, but also kind of noticed as well. It's almost look at me, don't look at me. That's perfectly understandable for the confusion that's going on in his head at the time, without the support network that potentially someone in his situation would be able to access more easily in 2022.
That maybe ties into why people say this is a bad movie. It is raising themes and messages, but it's very unclear on what it's trying to say.
True.
We get that, it's a different discussion point, but we get that with modern movies now, where some people say that a movie is too PC or too woke because the subtext is text. That's kind of why I like this movie, and I find this movie is fascinating, because it's not, even when characters are literally saying, this is what transvestite means, this is what transgender means, the movie is not really saying like, this is the point, there it is, this is a lesson. It's grappling with those issues. It's in real time with the audience trying to understand what's happening.
I mean, it's not very subtle, but I think even within the first few seconds, the only thing that they seem to care about across the whole film is sympathetic depictions, and I'm going to quote the film itself, "Judge ye not." That's what they seem to be. The only thing that they have focused is leave us alone. We're okay. Leave us alone, you know?
That is the opening text crawl. We'll get straight into it. So I've written down the whole thing here.
Go on then.
Well, it ties in with the whole movie. In the making of this film, which deals with a strange and curious subject, no punches have been pulled. No easy way out has been taken. Many of the smaller parts are portrayed by persons who are actually, in real life, the character they portray on the screen. This is a picture of stark realism, taking no sides, but giving you the facts, all the facts, as they are today. You are society. Judge ye not.
It definitely takes a side.
It absolutely does take a side. And if
it takes the right side, let's be honest.
Yes.
But it definitely takes a side.
Does it give you all the facts? I don't know. This is quite it makes some points, but as a paragraph is kind of confusing. And that is kind of Ed Wood's dialogue in a nutshell. There are points and there are messages, but the actual dialogue is very weird.
Yeah. Again, it all seems very worthy, well-meaning and sincere and earnest. I just wonder, who was this film for? Surely anyone who sympathises would just sit there and nod along and say, isn't this lovely? Anyone who doesn't sympathise would be like, lol, freaks. And I feel like that's a problem that we still have in modern society when it comes to trans rights being human rights. The 50s didn't have a solution to that, and I don't feel like we do even now.
Again, we're kind of doing almost a summary. It's so hard to nail down one concise thought on this movie, because scene by scene, the film seems to be about something different. And we'll get to it. We'll get an idea of the tone just from this opening. So we start with Bela Lugosi, full universal horror, spooky laboratory. He's mixing cocktails of smoking chemicals and proclaiming, "Pull the string, a life has begun." I have no idea what this has to do with the rest of the movie. You've seen Ed Wood, then Ed Wood knew Bela Lugosi, and Bela Lugosi was not in many movies at this time. So Ed Wood managed to rope him into this.
I would agree that I don't understand why it's there, but I really like it. It's Bela fucking Lugosi, and it's really gothy and cool, and there is no voice, other than perhaps Vincent Price, that you could consider to be cooler than Bela Lugosi's. I just love Bela Lugosi, and it's odd to see him in this context. I love it, I love it, I love it.
Yeah. And
why the fuck not?
It's a fun performance. Yeah, he was in the throes of a really bad morphine addiction at this time. Right after this movie, he went into hospital for addiction issues. So you could argue, was Ed Wood exploiting this older actor? But on the screen, he still got it.
So this film is 70 years old. It just feels like very little, particularly when you contextualize how far the LGB part of LGBT, how far we've managed to progress from what it was like in the 50s. It feels like the poor T-folk are just so far behind considering how far the rest of us have got. And I know there's been like hashtag LGB with the T kind of stuff on Twitter, which is very much my vibe. The LGB Alliance can go fuck themselves twice, cunts. Watching this film from the 50s, contextualizing it with how far people like myself, gay men, gay women, and bisexual people have managed to progress from the shit we had in the 50s and how little our trans brothers and sisters haven't. It broke my heart because I see a lot of absolutely hateful cuntery all over the place for trans folk, and I'm like, I just don't understand it. That they were appealing for compassion, understanding, and tolerance in 1953, and they still haven't got it.
And again, this movie barely touches upon the real story of Christine Jorgensen. Yeah, if you want to learn some trans history, pretty positive trans history, yeah, go look up her, because she got a sex change from abroad and came back to America a woman. She was very famous. She was on TV shows. She became quite a successful actress/singer. Her life was pretty positive. It was positive because of who she became.
And then you think of all the people that weren't famous and the shit they went through.
The newspapers made it out that she was the first to do this. And she always said, like, no, I'm just the first famous one. They would do. And this movie itself, the doctor in it makes a point. Hundreds of cases like this are happening. It's just, they're not in the newspapers. People don't know about them. People don't know about this life that other different people are living.
So little has changed for our trans brothers and sisters, and what this shows you is all these cunts claiming, oh, there weren't any trans people when I was a kid. Yes, there were. This film's 70 years old, you ridiculous twats who've done fuck all research other than sit there wallowing in your own hate. I'm quite passionate about this issue, Dev.
No, I love it. Yeah, don't mistake my silence for disagreement. I agree 100%.
I just like saying cunt on a podcast that I know Americans are going to listen to.
This is why this film is kind of interesting, because it was intended to be a straight, cheap biopic of one person. And instead it is kind of this weird ensemble of different stories and different people. In a way, it is kind of positive, because while Ed Wood is trying to, I guess, in his own mind, figure out what's what, we do get a blend of different lives coming together. This is like modern shows, like Queer as Folk and stuff like that. Different stories all happening at the same time. And I would say there's not many, the people you're talking about, there's not many negative people in this movie.
No,
they don't really get a voice, the naysayers.
Well, they do, but they get to be made to seem pretty fucking ridiculous. I love the wanky voice about aeroplanes. If the creator had meant us to fly, it's really, really well done. It's quite a classic and overdone kind of trope of ridicule, is to put a silly voice over someone's silly opinion. The idea of what nature has given us and what we've corrected, and, well, you're wearing glasses. Do you not think you should be wearing glasses then, seeing as we can't have sex changes? It's done in a way that nudges towards anti-religion, but not quite. I'll be honest, I'm not anti-religious, but I have found that people with strong faith are more likely, in my personal experience, to be homophobic. Strongly religious folk are much more likely to give me a hard time than people who are non-religious. I would never assume that someone being religious would make them hateful. I feel like this film does nudge towards a strong suggestion of that.
It's fascinating what Ed Wood did with it, because if you're talking about, people in religion or people, in Hollywood, say, there is a quote unquote normal way to live. Do you know what I mean? There's a path to go down. And I think without Ed Wood, this would have just been, I don't know if it would have been critical, but it would have been just, his a trans woman's life.
Exploitative, perhaps.
Yeah, it would have been, yeah. Because of his own experiences, Ed Wood put a lot of heart and sympathy into this.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
The first story, we get a number, it's a lot of vignettes and different stories. The first story we get, transvestite suicide. We get some of the characters here. We get a police inspector, visits a doctor to try and understand what's happening with the youths today. What are these people going through? And again, like I talked about, negative characters, a stereotype about the police these days, which there's a lot of stories to back that up about police versus the LGBT.
I mean, for me, I find it very difficult to be unbiased about that particular issue because I'm a gay man who lives in Manchester. And if you look up the history of the Greater Manchester Police and their victimisation of the LGBT community in Manchester, it's very difficult not to fall on the side of ACAB. But I don't feel like I'm as extreme as ever going on social media and using that provocative hashtag. But I don't really feel like I can actually be unbiased on that one.
It's less a matter of bias in this movie than it is technical level of Edward's skill. Every character just sounds like him.
I mean, I thought that the police officer was relatively sympathetic in this. It was more an ignorance rather than a hatred.
It didn't really seem like he was a character so much as, I don't know, just a person who has an interest about this.
Right.
I mean, the most egregious part of this little story is that we don't even learn anything about the person who committed suicide.
We learn that they stuck with what has become quite a convention of trans folk of going from Patrick to Patricia or Glen to Glenda. That's a convention that has continued over the next 70 years. But I think it's actually something that's dying out because people are starting to think, well, you could work out what my dead name is. So a lot of trans people are now going for a completely different name. But for the longest time, so, you know, I would have gone from Mark to Martha, were I trans. I know some trans folk now that are deliberately avoiding that convention to make sure that their dead name is forgotten.
Yeah, that is interesting in terms of how these social issues have updated since then to now, because it's never presented as a negative thing. They're not trying to be mean about it. But yeah, there is a lot of technical dead naming in this.
Yes.
The whole psychology of it back then in this movie is different. They do think of them as different people, like Glen and Glenda, but those characters don't think of dead naming or they don't think of moving on from that. These characters are very, yep, that's who I was and that's who I am now.
I sat through this film actively looking for them getting it wrong. And I don't feel there was very much other than the unfortunate, very brief scene where they go native.
Yeah.
That was a difficult watch. The very, very offensive depiction of people in Africa drumming and dancing with their masks and referring to males as the fancy ones. That was brief, but I don't think we can ignore it as it was pretty fucking racist.
Yeah, it was definitely simplistic. And I don't know if that's even true in any of the sense. Anyone growing up who's looked at like National Geographic or any kind of history or geography book like that, you've seen pictures of how the women dress up. I can't think of a better word, fancy clothes. That the men dress up in colourful garbs and stuff, whereas the women don't. Like, that's not really true.
No, it's not. The whole film was incredibly sensitive, even if it was slightly outdated, but that really did stick out like a sore thumb to me, and I was like, ow.
Yeah, there's things that work and things that don't quite work, and there's the plane and automobile debate.
Yes.
Do trans people want to be compared to vehicles? It's not a perfect analogy this film is making.
As a simplification for idiots, I actually think it works really well.
People were scared of planes. Like, if God wanted us to fly, then he'd give us wings and he'd give us wheels if he wanted us to drive. There's a sensitivity upgrade we've had in modern society where I think there is quite a difference between chromosomes and DNA than there are to, vehicles, because, the gender of the body, you either have it or you don't, and you can have it. No one has wings or wheels. Those vehicles are considered separate from the human body.
Perhaps the more updated thing is your eyes don't work as well as anybody else's. Should you wear glasses or not? Because the creator caused you to be more short-sighted than everybody else. And that's a little stronger than the aeroplane and wheels. Kind
of related to wheels. If someone was born disabled, would you be against them getting surgery to be able to walk?
Exactly.
That's closer. Yeah, we keep saying it. It's well-meaning, but it's kind of an antiquated. Here's a line. It's kind of maybe antiquated. Many transvestite actually wishes to be the opposite sex.
Like I was talking about before, there wasn't the level of vocabulary and understanding. You wouldn't call someone who felt that they were trapped in the wrong gendered body a transvestite anymore. You would call them trans.
Yeah, it's strange when you get lines like this, because it feels like, you know, if you look at medical journals, people say stuff about, this isn't how the human body works. I mean, medical journals are being updated all the time. Like every few years, major and minor steps are being made. So I imagine a lot of this is taken from medical journals, well-meaning, but wrong. Even within the film, statements like this don't add up. Glen does not want to be a member of the opposite sex. So it's weird that this film tries to throw in facts like this. The audience members can, you know, they can hear that and be like, oh yeah, many transvestites do want to be the opposite sex. But then like 5 minutes later, contradict that.
But at one point they point out very clearly that Glen is a transvestite but not homosexual. And that isn't as unusual as people think. It does happen quite a lot. You get a lot of straight people who will go to LGBT safe spaces dressed as a woman, but they're not interested in people of the same gender as them. It's an interesting one because up until recently, there'd been no straight people on RuPaul's Drag Race. Season 14 was the first straight man on RuPaul's Drag Race, which is fascinating that even now there are assumptions and prejudices and biases this film highlighted 70 years ago.
Yeah, I could just imagine the arguments from the Drag Race thing being like, well, you're not really one of us. You just like dressing up in fancy clothes.
The contestant got quite a lot of flack on social media for being straight, and it's like, for fuck's sake.
Yeah, what are they doing that is negative towards this culture? I mean, they want to be a part of this culture. Talking about Ed Wood and what's going on with Ed Wood shows up. Ed Wood is in this movie.
He is.
He plays the quote-unquote main character. He actually goes under the credits as a pseudonym. He is credited as Daniel Davis. He is starring opposite Barbara, who is played by Dolores Fuller. In real life, these two actors were dating.
Yep,
and you can tell from the acting that one of them is really invested in this, and the other one is just doing it because it's a job. Ed Wood's acting is so naturalistic in this. I'm not going to go out on a bat and say he's a fantastic actor because he doesn't do much in this movie. You can feel when he's saying these lines, it's like he's saying these lines. And then Dolores is very stiff. God, it makes me wonder because the contrast of this, at the end of the movie, spoilers, they work this all out and they stay together. That did not happen in real life.
No, it didn't. Barbara's acceptance is a dated acceptance, but feels very real and full of love. And it's a real shame that the actor behind it couldn't find that same piece herself and stay with Ed Wood.
No, it's a shame. But yeah, Ed Wood went through a number of relationships following this pattern. Once Dolores found out that he was a crossdresser, then they broke up. He quickly found another relationship with Norma McCarthy. She is in Plan 9. She is the air stewardess. So she's another actress that Ed Wood worked with. And again, they got married, and then shortly after, Ed Wood is like, oh, by the way, Glenda was based on me.
Fucking hell.
They never actually legally got divorced. They just split up, despite being married.
Wow.
Again, like a year later, he found another woman, Kathy O'Hara. From what I understand, they actually managed to make it work after she knew everything about him.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. I don't think the film Ed Wood gives you that level of detail. I'm
going to talk about some stuff regarding Glen and Glenda that happens after this movie. I'm going to stay clear of the last few years of his life because, well, I mean, the movie Ed Wood kind of ends right as Plan 9 is done. It kind of ends on a happy note. Like, yeah, they made the movie. Yeah, Ed Wood's life kind of goes the way of Bela Lugosi's. It's just a lot of alcoholism.
You can understand it.
Yeah.
You can understand why it happened, can't you?
7 out of 10 men are bald. I mean, maybe that statistic is right, but no, the hat myth about wearing a hat makes people go bald. That's not true.
I know. But what do you want me to say on this? I'm one of those 7 in 10 men. And I was completely receded by 27. I've had the same hairdo since then. It is a huge issue for male to female trans people that if they don't catch their receding or their bald patch before they start going onto female hormones, that they have to wear wigs. You can stop male baldness with hormones if you catch it quickly enough. But what you can't do is get it back by going onto female hormones. So if you don't catch it quick enough, you're bald permanently and you're a woman.
We need to get more movies with trans characters because we're really only at a point where we're getting trans actors playing trans roles. And like, that's great. Really, the most we're getting, I mean, unless people online, they have good examples. But it's like that. We've never seen that in a TV show or a movie, have we? That detail that someone has to live with.
Not that I can think of, no.
Yeah, this is not really a movie in the sense of actual characters. Almost every scene with Glen and Barbara is them just talking about transvestite issues.
Yeah, it's true. I would say that there is an element of sensationalism with the dramatic lightning whenever anyone suspects Glen. So there is some filmmaking, some real Ed Woodisms in there. It does take you out of the seriousness of the subject when it's dun, dun, dun.
I mean, there's some quite interesting ones, really interesting ones later in the movie. For most of it, it's basically people facing each other talking, people walking down the street, and then stock footage.
I love that stock footage existed in the 50s. You wouldn't have thought there'd have been that much stuff to stock yet.
Filmmaking back then was expensive. I mean, they actually used film. So, if you tried to make a movie, or at least an hour-long movie for the drive-ins, and you could only afford 40 minutes worth, what are you going to do? Sit on it? Or pad that out with 20 minutes of stock footage?
Yeah.
Just like, what's that later movie? Man or Monster with Bela Lugosi, where he had a bunch of stock footage of an octopus.
Yeah.
Bela Lugosi fights an octopus. That's part of the movie now. We get another definition of transvestites. We've had like 3 so far with Glen and Glenda.
Yeah.
Some kind of antiquated dialogue with whose sex life in all instances remains quite normal. It's all normal.
Yeah. The term normal I don't like. Also, at some point, they refer to people with trans issues as mentally wrong. No, that would not be used by someone trying to be sympathetic now. It was a simplification that has been clarified subsequently. It's not that there's any hate there, it's just it is very outdated.
Yeah, it definitely seems a mix of the antiquated knowledge that they knew back then and also what Ed Wood was dealing with, because this film multiple times is Glen's not gay. He's definitely not gay because Glen is Ed Wood. From everything I've learned, very straight and also quite a womanizer. He was very popular with the ladies. It gets all a bit muddied then, doesn't it? Trying to tell so many different stories and kind of overlapping those stories. So you're not quite clear what's going on, like who's into who and who's not into who and stuff. Yeah, we've got some stock footage here of that conversation between 2 older men, the new story.
Yeah.
Kind of dialogue instead of just the movie telling the audience what to believe. It's going through that dialogue of trying to get people to understand. And apparently, this is what I talked about, the longer versions. The longer version of this is one of the men started talking in a female voice. So
dear.
Guess there was a point/joke.
I think that cut, it sounds to me, was a wise one.
Glen and Glenda can be described as kind of almost documentary-like. It's mainly people talking very dryly about issues.
Except for the dream sequence.
Yeah, then Ed Wood got very David Lynch, and there is an extended sequence with no dialogue, all visuals. But what did you think was happening here? Like, what did you make of all this?
Well, it wasn't Ed Wood, was it? It was producer George Weiss who added it to pad it out to an hour. There's a lot to pick up on. It feels like the inclusion of the devil makes it a little anti-religious. I see no point to these dream sequences. And some of the erotica, even though it's tame in as much as there's no tits, there's no actual sex or anything, but I found it quite unpleasant to watch, and it felt like it made the characters of the narrator, played by Bela Lugosi, and Glen come across as really quite fucking pervy, which goes against the grain of the previous ideas in the film.
It's again that complicated nature of, rather than just a movie about one issue, trans, he has made a whole LGBTQAI, a plus movie, in that he is trying to tackle everything at the same time, and everything kind of overlaps. I mean, you talked about the pervy nature. It is kind of dealing with some, well, I mean, I say dealing with, we're talking in context because it was stock footage. BDSM stuff, lesbianism, women are tying up other women. I guess you could either interpret it as unconsensual, male on female sexual action,
yeah,
or possibly rough sex. Kind of reminds me about overlap with the pride parades that we've been having. Certain members of the community don't want any shirtless people. They don't want any reference to sex toys or adult nature. They want to keep it very PG. I guess the inclusion of all this stuff is like, we exist. You've got to handle all of us. If we're going to go out in public, then we're not going to be this sanitized, okay version.
I genuinely think that the film would have been better without this scene in it.
Some of it is stock footage, but some of it is footage including Glen and Glenda. We have a weird moment where it looks like an earthquake has happened. A full tree is inside the house for some reason, pinning Barbara to the ground. While Glen is wearing female clothes, he cannot lift the tree because I guess he's feminine, but then when he's in a suit and tie, he can lift it. He embraces Barbara and they kiss. I don't know what that's trying to say.
I got nothing. Sorry. The whole thing kind of confused me and really, I felt undermined the rest of the film, really.
I don't know what the devil thing is talking about. When talking about it being a wild movie and it being a terrible movie, they're like, well, it's about trans issues and for some reason the devil is in it. I can't disagree. Why is the devil in this? Because I don't understand. There's a moment and it's very visual, it's very symbolic, where these random citizens apparate inside the living room. They all surround Glen in mailwear in the corner, and then the devil comes over, waves his hands, and then like a cocoon, these people spread out and disappear, and out comes Glenda, and she's very proud in her look. But why is the devil doing this?
It really does feel like something written by a well-meaning cis person, whereas the rest of the film feels a lot more authentic.
I guess, like David Lynch, is one of those things where the message is deliberately so unclear that you can read anything into it. But I think the difference is, I think Ed Wood probably had a very clear idea of what this meant, whereas David Lynch is deliberately vague, and he knows that it will take multiple meanings. We get a moment with Glen's sister coming in and finding him in women's clothes. Dialogue of her trying to understand it. There's another scene of two people trying to understand what is happening with these people. Did that scene add anything to you, for you?
This film would have actually benefited from being a 30-minute documentary, which literally just told the story of Glen or Glenda without the Patricia stuff, without the Alan and Anne stuff, and certainly without the dream sequence. If they'd have tightened it and made it a 30-minute documentary, this could have made a huge difference.
It's strange. Yeah, some of the conversations, they don't really go anywhere. We have a conversation here now, wrapping up the Glen or Glenda storyline. It's in the title, Glen or Glenda, with a question mark. The quote here, the problem is Glenda, Glen's other half, the girl that he himself is, his other individual personality. That is kind of an antiquated understanding of everything today, isn't it?
It is, and that would probably be considered schizophrenia.
Or what you talked about, drag personas?
True.
But then, transgender people these days don't consider themselves, metaphorically maybe, but they don't really consider themselves a different personality from their old life. So it's maybe he was grappling with that persona side of himself as an entertainer, because he was an entertainer behind the scenes as much as he was on screen. So this felt like a very personal issue that he was grappling with. There's all sorts of ties together with the doctor we've been seeing. Him and Barbara see the doctor. This scene is kind of filled with so many different topic points. We get mention of pseudo-hermaphrodites. We get transvestites have quote-unquote cured their condition by quote-unquote cutting off the supply of the root cause. The conclusion this film lands on and the happy ending between Glen and Barbara, it's definitely antiquated, because it kind of goes against what everyone is trying to do these days. Like, the film is positive, the film is sympathetic, but for many people today, the happy ending isn't being cured and isn't getting rid of this.
No, of course not.
Because that is kind of what happens with Glen or Glenda. They consider Glenda kind of an aberration. It's a psychological issue that Glen is dealing with, and they basically get rid of it once he has found this heteronormative relationship with a real woman.
Yeah.
It's not great. It's not positive, that is it?
No. It's probably as positive as it could have been for the time, but it doesn't ring true in a modern situation.
Yeah, and I just don't quite understand what Ed Wood was going for here. It doesn't even ring true for himself. In history, he repeatedly reveals to his partners that he is a crossdresser. He never considers it something that he wants to get rid of. I mean, up until the 70s, when he's shooting no-budget pornographic films, he is filming those in women's clothes. This is not an issue that he considers an issue that he wants to get rid of. So I'm not quite sure why he made this ending if it goes against what he believes.
Well, maybe it's a desire rather than his reality.
Yeah, possibly.
You know, I've been through wanting the gay to go away when I was a kid. Very much so. I really desperately wanted it to go away, and I was convinced by society that maybe I could meet the right girl. Spoilers, that isn't how it works. But maybe there was a true desire there, and that's what he actually genuinely wanted, which is very sad.
I mean, contextually, but I think he was in his mid-20s when he made this. So that's still relatively young. Yeah, I think late 20s, yeah. I mean, sadly, he did die only like 56 or something.
That's pretty young.
Yeah, so these are not issues that he really fully grappled with, unlike the second story we got with Alan and Anne, which is much closer to the story of Christine Jorgensen, which is a much more positive, I made a change in my life, and it was for the right reasons, and it worked out.
Yeah.
Pretty much all stock footage, and then just narration. Documentary like someone transitioning, really, isn't it?
Again, that could have not been included in this film and been like a 5-minute public information type situation. Maybe had more of an impact.
I mean, it really comes back to the whole thing that this was just banking off an actual story.
Yeah.
However good this story might have been told, I mean, the story was already told in real life and people were hearing this. This is also, again, confusingly, only tangentially based on Ed Wood. Again, it might have just been another tall tale from him, but supposedly he wore women's underwear underneath his military garb while serving in World War II.
I feel like that would be very difficult. You can't truly kind of understand a desperate person's desperate situation. So
yeah, this movie wraps up with the, as we said, the quote-unquote happy ending of getting Glen. It answers the title of the movie. We get Glen, not Glenda.
Barbara's acceptance is incredibly dated, almost like a cop-out. This film is supposed to be fucking positive, but one of the last things they say is Frankenstein's monster to describe someone who's trans.
Oh yeah, that was maybe not the best analogy.
No, felt like a slap round the face for me personally. After it had been so gentle and kind to the trans community, to then use a term like that, I was like, really?
The movie Glen or Glenda is a mixed bag. But despite answering the question, Glen or Glenda, this story kind of continues. And this is something barely anyone knows about.
Okay.
So after he had made Glen or Glenda, he did Plan 9, he did a few other movies, not many. He was never very successful. And about 10 years after this, the early 60s, he had given up making movies, well, aside from pornographic movies, but he got to novel writing. Apparently he could crank out like a 120-page novel in like a weekend. So he was doing that constantly.
Good grief.
Just to make money. He wrote like 80 crime/sex novels, dirty kind of giallo kind of stories that you have on the top shelf. There's a bunch of titles. I'm just going to name some of them and you'll tell like, yeah, this sounds like Ed Wood. Sideshow Siren, Drag Trade, Bloodiest Sex Crimes of History, Nighttime Les, Bye Bye Broady, The Perverts, The Gay Underworld, Sex Shrouds and Caskets, Sex Museum,
Holy fuck.
Hell Chicks, Purple Thighs, To Make a Homo, A Study of Sexual Practices in Witchcraft and Black Magic, A Study of Fetishes and Fantasies, Tales of a Sexy Night, Diary of a Transvestite Hooker, and...
Oh, good. I don't want to read any of these.
Well, this one I kind of want to read because it's possibly Ed Wood. He wrote so many. The Adult Version of Dracula. That's the title.
Oh, good grief. The title is The Adult Version of Dracula.
And I guess he wrote that because he knew the real Dracula.
Fuck me.
Yeah, a lot of these stories were quite shocking. Well, I mean, there was a lot of cheap smut out there at the time, so it wasn't unique, yeah, he was really diving into these really dark and, as we said, like BDSM, the more adult side of LGBT life. He wrote a couple of books. The main character was a transvestite called Glen.
What?
Yeah. In 1963, we have Killer in Drag, stars a young character named Glen who hopes to have a sex change funded by his sugar daddy, a wealthy real grandma type homosexual. That was in quotes.
Fucking hell.
When his servant, who is dressed in a short-skirted maid's outfit, who is a man, I should point out,
Good.
The sugar daddy is murdered, and then Glen is falsely blamed, and he has to go on the run. And he ends up in a circus, kind of like Ed Wood was at some point, has an ex-girlfriend called Barbara.
Wait, is this actually supposed to be the same fucking character?
It's the same names. When he's at the carnival, he meets a half-man, half-woman called Shirley. Back in the circus Ed Wood worked at, in general, in his life, he called his female persona Shirley.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley. What the fuck is going on here? Are you suggesting we read this book?
Well, I mean, it's still kind of available, but I mean, it's crazy. It's like, this was mostly a documentary about transvestitism, transgender issues. And then he, for a sequel, wrote just like a Raymond Chandler crime novel.
I don't know. I kind of think I want to read this, but I also really, really, really don't want to read this.
Once we read that, then we have to read the third one, Death of a Transvestite in 1967.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Where the character of Glen is on death row after supposedly killing a hitman called Paul/Paula.
Are you making this up?
I am not. And at the end of the day, all Glen wants to do when he gets sent to the electric chair is to die while dressed as Glenda.
Right, looking at Glen or Glenda, this 70-year-old film with 2022 vision. As a piece of LGBT history, it's actually incredible. As proof that trans people have been around a lot longer than cunts think they have, it's valuable. But from what you've said about these novels, it feels like a step back. And I wonder whether I would really hate them or not.
It really depends on how those books are written, because, again, he wrote for money, and he wrote very quickly. I don't know, it's kind of like putting the gay issues and stuff in media. It's kind of like the killing the gays trope. I don't think LGBT characters should be confined to just the good guy.
True.
It's pretty fucking metal. The main character of a 50s or 60s crime novel is a transvestite. A transvestite killer for hire.
True.
That could be very cool if that was adapted into a movie.
I'm tentatively fascinated by these books. I think I'm going to either love them or hate them,
I wonder, because we can talk about how the movie ties in with the Chucky movies, but I wonder if Don knew about these books, because that does fit the character of Glen/Glenda more.
Yeah.
In the books, Glen is the innocent, I say normal in terms of crime, boy, and Glenda is the more violent personality side. And that is how it is with the doll. Glenda is the one that kills people.
Obviously, the naming convention and the actual Glen or Glenda name, he's clearly got a fondness for this film. I'd be fascinated to know whether he'd read the books, though.
I did, in all my research, one of the last things I did was actually look up what Don had to say on Glen or Glenda, and I couldn't really find anything. All of the recent results are articles saying Glen or Glenda might be in season 2, or he might be in season 1. Aside from news stories like that, I don't think there's ever really been a big interview where he's talked about it. Maybe in the commentary, maybe in the movie commentary.
If there are commentaries out there, we could look at doing specials on them. Imagine if we could ask that question to Don Mancini, because if we got an interview with Don Mancini, I wouldn't want to ask the standard bullshit. I'd want to really think about the kind of questions that he hasn't been asked. But I would damn sure ask him that fucking question. I'd ask him a lot about Seed of Chucky, actually, which most people would probably avoid talking to him about Seed of Chucky.
No, I am fascinated what he thinks of the film, like really in depth, because it's really just an hour of discussion points, one after the other. Which
is quite similar to Glen or Glenda, actually.
And Seed of Chucky. That film really throws a lot at the audience.
That's what I mean. The two of them, obviously in very different methodology, do exactly that.
it's something that he's addressed in the Chucky series. We talked about it ourselves when we covered Seed of Chucky. We had to have a think about what Glen or Glenda actually was. Like, what kind of personality decision was that within the character? What did they go with? They made a mention of it, didn't they?
Gender fluid.
That's it. That's the word. Yeah, they went with gender fluid. Yeah. Which again is kind of terminology like gender queer, gender fluid. Ed Wood did not have any of this terminology back then.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? They had more when Seed was filmed, but they had even more when the Chucky TV series was filmed. So the Chucky TV series updated what they said in Seed of Chucky, and Seed of Chucky had a more updated way of looking at it than Glen or Glenda. And you just wonder, you know, towards the end of our life, in 20 years or so, 30 years or so, what progress we will have made. And I think, in a weird way, Glen or Glenda, Seed of Chucky, the Chucky TV series, shows you very clearly in media, sympathetic media, about these issues, how far we actually have got. But it also highlights how far we haven't got compared to other minorities. Look at me being super serious. Should we make a knob gag or something?
In terms of the progress you said, when is it going to be a complete non-issue? Do you know what I mean? I feel like that is maybe the end point when we have someone like Glen on screen, and in one scene they're wearing male clothes, and in another scene they're wearing female clothes. Whilst we have the vocabulary, we could call that character gender fluid or gender queer. In a movie, do we even need to say that? Can we not just have that character just be who they are? And then, at the very most, have the director or the actor or whatever say in an interview, yeah, they were genderqueer.
So for me, I don't think I'll ever see that in my lifetime. I don't feel we've made anything resembling the kind of progress I would have liked to have seen from 1953 to 2022. That makes me sad. But I will add a caveat to that. When I was a closet teenager and closet early 20s and I was scared of who I was, never in my wildest dreams did I ever think I'd be able to marry a man. So who fucking knows?
I think we're slowly getting there with trans actors. I mean, one person I can think of is a comedian I love, Patty Harrison, and she's a trans woman. The Netflix show I Think You Should Leave, the Lost City, you know, the Sandra Bullock one. She's a supporting actress in that. I mean, I haven't seen that movie, but I think she's playing a character, and I don't think, not in the I Think You Should Leave, they never mention that she's trans, that none of the sketches are about her being trans. She is just an actress in that role. So I think we are slowly getting there. It's a different issue, and maybe something people don't see as serious. Transvestites, you know, people wearing different clothes. It's, you know, you see that, it's visual. People feel like you need an explanation for that. And I think that's maybe the end point of this representation. I guess it's a weird word, you know, people think representation in media means we have to explain that representation. I feel like that's like one of the last hurdles we need to get over. People can just, gay actors, they don't have to play gay roles or say that they're gay.
Yeah, I think you're right. It feels like we've made huge amounts of progress, but it also feels like we've made not enough. The modern human condition, isn't it? It's great to see what we've achieved, but there's always ambition, and I think that's kind of okay.
Yeah.
Dev, I've really enjoyed talking about this. Yeah. And I'm going to go back to what I said at the start, that I genuinely think that it's borderline pernicious to suggest that this is one of the worst films ever made. You could say that about Plan 9 from Outer Space. There is no social value, but this has so much history, context, and empathy that to suggest that this is one of the worst films ever made is just wrong.
For an hour, on a technical level, maybe you could kind of consider it a mess. The Riff Tracks guys, they have covered this movie multiple times. In the multiple times they've done it, they say it's one of their favourite movies to do. Each time, they've kept focused so much on the technical values, you know, like weird acting and weird blocking and stuff. And they've always made a point to say they are never making fun of what the movie is trying to say.
Yeah.
They genuinely enjoy the movie for what it is going for.
We've probably got a similar view. Some of the acting is absolutely diabolical. Some of the stock footage is fucking hilarious. I'll be damned if I didn't come out of this film feeling educated and a little bit more of a socially educated human being and almost a better person for having spent some time thinking about this film. I value the hour that I spent watching Glen or Glenda.
Like Glen/Glenda in Seed of Chucky. I think Seed of Chucky has value because I think our thoughts on it were it is confusing and it is a little muddied on what it's trying to say. Don Mancini is trying to say something. There is value to the viewer having a conversation, trying to figure out what that is.
I agree. It's going to be fascinating if they pull the trigger and bring in Glen and or Glenda, because the last time we saw them, they were two separate kids. I think it's going to be amazing.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated how they could even do that, because there's so many options. Like you said, they're two separate people now. There's so many options of what they could do with that, because I mean, technically there's two characters now.
It needs to be very well thought out and very sensitively done. And I think now is the time for them to give it a damn good go.
And you know what I thought? There's a second reference to Glen and Glenda in Chucky, in the show. Tiffany has a box of explosives. She says
Glenda.
Those are a gift from Glenda. Tiffany and Chucky, they love stabbing people, maybe shooting people. But you know who has plastic explosives? Killer for Hires. This is like the books. If Glen or Glenda came back as an adult who was also now like an assassin who knows Kung Fu,
holy shit,
who additionally knows Kung Fu as canon in Seed of Chucky, they could be an even more professional killer than Chucky now.
Holy shit. I would just love to see them be brave enough to have another go at what they tried in Seed of Chucky in the Chucky TV series. I would love to see that.
Well, we could possibly talk for another hour about what we want with this character in season 2.
We could.
But I think we have reasonably wrapped it up as much as we can on Glen or Glenda 1953 and the discussions around it. We always call out for viewer interactions, but I would love people to comment on Twitter. Tell us what you think about this movie or some of the discussion points. If you're trans or transvestite or anything, just say how maybe you connect to Glen or Glenda. We'd love to hear more about the community.
And I think I also want to highlight, although I consider myself relatively well-informed and educated when it comes to trans issues, I would very much welcome anyone just not necessarily calling me out, but explaining to me if I've got anything wrong during this podcast or I've said anything that's outdated or insensitive. I would welcome positive, helpful discourse if that has happened at any point during this discussion, because neither of us are trans. We would love to hear from our trans friends about how they feel about this film and how they feel about Seed of Chucky and what they would want to see with the Glen or Glenda character.
If you want to talk to us other than at CHUCKYVISION, then you can find us other places. You could find me, Dev, over on at Absolute Travesty on Twitter. I also do a horror podcast. Another horror podcast. I do Forever Friday, which is about Friday the 13th. I am selling horror-themed t-shirts and mugs and hats and stuff. If you like Final Destination, if you like Final Fantasy, I have somehow mashed those two IPs together. Mark, where can people find you?
If you're looking for me on Twitter and Instagram, it's at MarkAdamsHC. I am better at Twitter than Instagram because I don't like Instagram. The current podcast projects I'm working on at the moment are Shipwrecked and Comatose, which is a Red Dwarf podcast. You can find that at Red Dwarf Pod on Twitter. I also do a podcast about kids TV. That's called Writing the Childhood at RITC Pod on Twitter. And I'm currently also doing a podcast called Geek Polymath, which is a podcast about me being a bit of a never really having an obsession about any major geeky thing, but quite liking lots of them. So I find someone who knows a lot about something I quite like, an expert, and we have a chat about whatever that is. So far, we've had episodes on Marvel Comics, craft beer, and RuPaul's Drag Race. Who knows what else is coming up? But yeah, that's at Geek Polymath on Twitter as well. All of these podcasts that we've talked about are available on whatever podcast platform you are currently listening to CHUCKYVISION. Just search for the names.
Fantastic. And so this has been another episode of CHUCKYVISION. We'll see you next time when we are covering something Chucky related.
We haven't actually decided yet, so we can't tell you.
You'll find out one way or another. But until then, pull the string! Lightning strike.
Fuck's sake, dude. CHUCKYVISION is a podcast brought to you by the We Made This Network. Follow us on Twitter at CHUCKYVISION. Follow the network on Twitter at WMT_network. Our website is WeMadeThisNetwork.com. The logo was designed by Carl Bryan and the theme tune composed by Dark Fantasy Studios. Wanna play?